The first train carrying German women prisoners of war arrived in the small American camp in Wisconsin during a cold winter morning in December 1944. As the train screeched to a halt, the women slowly stepped off the platform, their eyes squinting in the harsh morning light, still adjusting to their new reality. They had spent weeks on the move, traveling in crowded, cold conditions, their bodies aching and their spirits worn thin from the constant fear of what awaited them. Each woman was dressed in the same ill-fitting, faded uniform, and their expressions reflected the exhaustion of both their journey and their captivity. The camp was unlike anything they had expected. As they looked around, they saw neat rows of barracks, and although the surroundings were stark and utilitarian, there was an undeniable sense of order. The American soldiers who met them did not appear hostile or unkind. They followed the protocols of the Geneva Convention, addressing the women with respect and ensuring they were treated with basic decency. The women were confused by the lack of aggression, the calmness of their captors contrasting sharply with the stories they had been told about the brutality of the enemy. They were assigned their quarters, small but clean, with simple wooden beds and warm blankets. There were no harsh punishments, no signs of the cruelty they had been warned to expect. This reality seemed like a dream to them, a disorienting departure from the image they had of American captivity, an image filled with violence, deprivation, and humiliation. Instead, they found themselves in an environment that, while still a prison, bore little resemblance to the hellish tales that had been ingrained in their minds during their months of travel. By midday, the women were led to the mess hall for their first meal on American soil. The smell of vegetable soup filled the air, familiar but institutional. The soldiers had gone out of their way to prepare what they could, and the women, though hungry and wary, were not sure how to react to the food laid before them. They expected meager rations, hard bread, and tasteless meals designed to sustain rather than satisfy, but instead there was soup, freshly made and steaming, alongside something altogether unexpected, a small bundle of toilet paper and sanitary pads placed carefully on their trays. At first, the women stared at these items in disbelief. They could not comprehend why they had been given such things. For many, the idea of receiving sanitary supplies was foreign, something they had never imagined could be offered with such care. In their previous lives, they had been used to making do with whatever they had, often going without for long periods of time. The thought that these basic, personal needs would be provided for them so generously felt to them almost absurd. The first reaction was confusion, and then disbelief, quickly followed by awkward silence. The women exchanged glances, unsure whether to take these items or leave them behind. The idea that these were meant as a sign of respect or care was difficult to accept. They had been raised in a world where such kindness was scarce, if not completely absent. In their minds, it was impossible that the enemy could offer something so seemingly trivial yet deeply personal without some hidden agenda. As they hesitated, the guards, who had been watching them quietly, seemed unfazed. They acted as if these gestures were entirely natural, a normal part of daily life. The women, however, found it impossible to accept the situation at face value. They felt that, despite the relative comforts of the camp, there was something strange about this kindness. It was not that they rejected the gifts, far from it, but they simply could not understand why they were being treated with this level of dignity, given the context of war and the animosity that had marked their journey to this point. Despite their confusion, a few women slowly took the toilet paper and sanitary pads, reluctantly using them for the first time. It was a strange feeling, as if they were crossing some invisible line that separated their past suffering from this new reality. The simple act of having access to these supplies, something so basic and personal, felt almost like a betrayal of their past hardships. They had survived without them for so long, and now they had to accept them, even if it was difficult to do so. As the day drew to a close, the women lay in their beds, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. Their minds were a whirl of conflicting emotions. On one hand, they were grateful for the basic comforts they had been given: warmth, food, hygiene. But on the other, they could not shake the feeling that something was not right. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty, not kindness. The very presence of such simple, thoughtful gifts challenged everything they had been taught to believe about their captors. It was a new beginning, but it was also a challenge to their understanding of what it meant to be a prisoner of war. The following days passed with an eerie quiet as the women adjusted to their new surroundings. They were still processing the shock of being treated with such unexpected decency. The toilet paper and sanitary pads, initially seen as absurd, continued to weigh heavily on their minds. They tried to ignore the gifts, but they couldn't shake the lingering confusion. It was as though something so simple, so human, had been offered to them as a sign of care, and yet it felt almost insulting in its unfamiliarity. As the women moved through their daily routines, the discomfort with the gifts became more pronounced. The item that had caused the most discomfort was the toilet paper. To many of them, it was nothing more than a luxury they had never thought necessary, and they couldn't understand why the Americans were offering it to them. In the harsh conditions of war, the concept of cleanliness was often put aside for survival, and now they were faced with an abundance they had never experienced before. Greta, who had taken on a leadership role among the group, found herself struggling with these feelings of confusion. She had always been proud of her ability to maintain her dignity, even in the most difficult situations. But now, faced with this unexpected generosity, she felt an unsettling sense of vulnerability. She was not used to receiving things from others, especially not from their enemies. Her instincts told her to reject the offer, to maintain the stoic distance that had been instilled in her through years of hardship. Yet, as she watched the others, it became clear that they were in a similar state of internal conflict. Some women, like Anna Marie, had cautiously taken the sanitary pads and used them as best as they could, unsure of their proper use but grateful for the comfort they provided. Others, like Helga, still felt a deep sense of resistance. They couldn't understand why these things were being given to them, and they questioned the motivations behind such gestures. The turning point came one afternoon when a few of the women began to talk openly about their discomfort. It was during one of their small, informal meetings in the corner of the barracks when a hushed voice from behind said, "Why do we feel ashamed of these things?" It was Liesel, the youngest of the women, whose innocent question carried more weight than anyone realized. The women fell silent, realizing that the discomfort they were feeling wasn't from the items themselves, but from the deeper implication of them. They had been stripped of so much, forced to give up everything they knew. But now they were being given back some semblance of human dignity, and it felt both strange and deeply unsettling. Greta, always the pragmatic one, took a deep breath and spoke, her voice steady but tinged with a note of uncertainty. "Perhaps we were wrong to laugh," she said, referring back to the moment when they first mocked the cornbread. "Maybe we are meant to accept these things not as charity, but as a reminder that we are still human." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the others. They were finally beginning to understand that this was not about humiliation or insult, but about offering them the respect they had been denied for so long. As the evening approached and the women settled into their routines, Greta found herself sitting alone on her cot, the sanitary pads placed carefully beside her. She ran her fingers over the rough texture of the toilet paper, feeling the weight of what it represented. It was not just a commodity, it was a message. In their minds, they had been reduced to objects of war, but now, in this strange land, they were being offered a chance to reclaim their humanity. The following days saw a gradual shift in their behavior. They began to use the items more freely, no longer looking at them with suspicion. The awkwardness started to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The women's initial resistance had given way to a slow understanding. They still didn't fully grasp why these things had been offered to them, but they were starting to see that it was a gesture of respect, something they had never experienced before. They were no longer just prisoners of war, they were women, treated with care. But even as they began to use the toilet paper and sanitary pads with a growing sense of normality, there was still an underlying question that lingered. Why had the Americans, their captors, treated them with such unexpected kindness? The women knew that there was no simple answer, but as they looked around at their fellow prisoners, they understood that perhaps, after all the horrors they had faced, this small act of humanity was something they could hold on to. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough for now. As the days continued to unfold in the camp, the women found themselves adjusting to a new rhythm. There was still a certain unease hanging in the air, a silent tension that none of them could quite explain. While the guards had shown them kindness, and the barracks were warmer than any of them had imagined, they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a deep internal conflict, as if they were being tested, not just by the conditions of the camp, but by their own resistance to accepting this unexpected form of care. Greta, ever the leader, spent most of her time trying to maintain control, not only of the women, but of her own emotions. She had seen too much of the war to let herself get lost in what felt like a brief moment of reprieve. Yet the more she observed the small acts of kindness, the care in the way the soldiers served food, the way they treated the women with respect, the harder it became to maintain her distance. There was an unfamiliar warmth in the air, and it was disorienting. She knew she had to protect herself from getting too comfortable, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the underlying truth. They were being treated with more dignity than they had ever been shown by their own people. One evening, as Greta sat in the barracks, she watched the other women interact with the American guards. It was subtle, the shift in their behavior. Where once they had been withdrawn, cautious, and skeptical, now they were slowly beginning to engage. They asked questions, offered help when the guards were in need, and accepted small gestures of kindness without the suspicion they once carried. Greta noticed how Liesl, the youngest, smiled at one of the guards when he handed her a piece of bread. It was small, but it signaled a change, a shift from fear to a tentative trust. Greta realized that the toilet paper, the sanitary pads, and even the simple meals were not just acts of care, but a way of challenging their perceptions of what it meant to be an enemy. They had been raised to view the Americans with disdain, to think of them as cold and ruthless. Yet the camp was proving to be a place of humanity, a stark contrast to everything they had been taught. It wasn't just the comforts they were receiving that confused them. It was the quiet, unspoken understanding that the war could be fought with decency, even in the worst of circumstances. As the days turned into weeks, the women began to open up, bit by bit. Their conversations, once filled with bitterness and anger, started to shift toward more neutral topics. They talked about their families back home, their hopes for the future, and their shared experiences of loss. Even in the middle of their captivity, there was a sense of healing beginning to take place. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. They no longer saw themselves as just prisoners. They saw each other as survivors, connected by a shared experience of war and trauma. One afternoon, Greta found herself alone in the mess hall, deep in thought. She had been reflecting on her role in the group, how she had become both a leader and a prisoner, holding on to the memory of the woman she used to be. She had always believed that survival meant holding on to her pride, her sense of self. But here, in this strange place, she was learning that survival also meant embracing vulnerability, accepting kindness, and allowing herself to feel. It was an uncomfortable realization, but it was one that slowly began to break down the walls she had built around her heart. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice calling her name. It was Anna Marie, the eldest of the women, who had been quieter than most of the others. She was holding a piece of bread, looking at Greta with an expression that was both uncertain and grateful. "I never thought I would be here," Anna Marie said, her voice trembling slightly. "But now I don't know what to think. I didn't expect this kindness." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of the shared experience they had all been going through. Greta nodded slowly, her gaze softening. She knew exactly what Anna Marie meant. They had all expected the worst: cruelty, deprivation, isolation. But instead, they were being shown something entirely different: the possibility of a future where people could be more than enemies. A future where the lines between them and their captors were not as clear-cut as they had been taught to believe. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was one that Greta knew they had to accept if they were ever to move forward. Later that evening, as Greta lay in her bed, the quiet of the camp settling around her, she found herself reflecting on the changes she had witnessed. The women had begun to understand something that was hard for them to admit: that they were no longer just victims of war. They were people, with their own stories, their own dignity, and their own capacity for kindness. The toilet paper and sanitary pads had not just been a simple gift. They had been a symbol of this new reality, one that had turned their understanding of captivity on its head. They were learning to accept care, even from their enemies, and in doing so, they were reclaiming their humanity, piece by piece. As the weeks passed, the women began to experience a shift that they had not anticipated. What had started as an uncomfortable acceptance of their captor's kindness gradually turned into something more profound. Greta, in particular, found herself questioning long-held beliefs. She had always seen the enemy through the lens of propaganda, cold, distant, and without compassion. Now, surrounded by the subtle warmth of the camp's atmosphere, she couldn't help but notice the growing connections between the women and the guards, connections that were not born out of coercion or force, but out of simple human decency. One evening, as Greta sat in the common area, she noticed Liesl speaking to a young American soldier. It was a brief exchange, just a few words shared between them, but there was something different about it. Liesl was no longer the shy, timid girl who had been afraid to look anyone in the eye when she first arrived. She was smiling, laughing even, in a way that Greta had not seen before. The walls between the prisoners and their captors were slowly starting to crumble, piece by piece, and it left Greta with an unsettling feeling. Despite her own inner conflict, Greta couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she watched the women interact with the soldiers. The younger women, like Liesl, had started asking questions about American life, about the food they ate and the places they came from. They were curious, not just about the soldiers, but about the world outside their small, confined space. It was clear that the longer they stayed, the more they wanted to understand the people around them. They were no longer content to remain isolated in their own bitterness. In contrast, the older women, like Anna Marie, still held on to a certain reserve. They had lived through too much to easily embrace these new changes. Anna Marie had been the first to speak openly about her doubts regarding the kindness shown to them. She had lived through years of hardship and loss, and the idea of accepting any form of kindness from the enemy felt like betrayal to everything she had ever believed in. But as time passed, even she began to soften, though she remained cautious. She had learned to accept the food and the basic comforts they were being given, but there was still a part of her that could not fully let go of the walls she had built around herself. Greta had always been the leader, the one who kept her emotions in check, the one who held the group together. But now she found herself struggling with the very things that had once defined her. She had always been taught to lead with strength, to maintain control, but here in the camp, she was learning that true strength came from vulnerability.
It was hard for her to admit, but she was beginning to understand that it was okay to let down her guard, to allow herself to be treated with kindness, even by those who had once been her enemies.
One afternoon, while Greta was walking through the camp, she overheard a conversation between two soldiers. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Greta could hear the words clearly. "We're not just holding them here," one soldier said. "We're showing them a different side of us, a side they never thought we had." It was a simple statement, but it hit Greta with the force of a revelation. She had never thought of it that way. She had assumed that the American soldiers saw them only as prisoners, as the enemy. But now it seemed that they, too, were learning something from this experience. Later that day, Greta found herself in the mess hall, serving food alongside some of the soldiers. She had volunteered, wanting to do something productive, something to feel useful. As she worked, she began to notice the small gestures that had once seemed insignificant. The way the soldiers would make sure there was enough for everyone, the way they would smile or nod in recognition, as if acknowledging that they were all in this together. There was no longer an air of superiority, no longer the distant hierarchy that had once defined their interactions. It was as if they were all sharing in the same experience, regardless of their roles. As the days passed, the emotional distance between the women and the soldiers continued to narrow. There were still moments of tension, of course, small misunderstandings, awkward silences, but they became less frequent. The women began to help with tasks around the camp, learning small trades from the soldiers, from cleaning the kitchen to organizing supplies. These tasks were not just about survival. They were about reclaiming a sense of agency, about taking part in something larger than their captivity. Greta began to notice changes in herself as well. She found herself speaking more freely, laughing more easily, even sharing stories of her life back home. It was as if the walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down, brick by brick. She was learning to trust again, not just the soldiers, but her fellow prisoners as well. There was a newfound camaraderie among them, a sense of solidarity that had not been present when they first arrived. It was as though, in this strange and difficult environment, they had become a family of sorts, bound not by blood, but by shared experience. The ripple effect of this transformation was undeniable. What had begun as a reluctant acceptance of kindness had turned into something more, something that went beyond the physical comforts they were given. It was a shift in perspective, a recognition that even in the most dire of circumstances, there was still room for compassion, for connection, for the human need to be seen and treated with dignity. The women no longer saw themselves as just victims of war. They were beginning to see themselves as people once again, with agency, with strength, and with the ability to change the world around them, even in small ways. Greta lay in bed that night, thinking about all that had transpired. She had come to realize that this camp, this place of confinement, had become something entirely unexpected, a place of healing. She had fought against the idea for so long, but now she understood. Sometimes survival meant not just enduring, but learning to accept, to grow, and to embrace the kindness that was offered, even when it came from the most unlikely of sources. The days grew colder as winter took hold of the camp, and with it, a new set of challenges emerged. The women had settled into their routines, but the reality of being prisoners of war still loomed over them. Despite the warmth and care they had received from the soldiers, the harshness of their circumstances could not be ignored. The food, while adequate, was not enough to keep the hunger in their stomachs at bay for long, and the cold seeped into their bones, making every day a struggle to stay warm and focused. Yet there was something different now, a sense of purpose that had been absent in the early days. It was during one particularly frigid afternoon that Liesl, who had begun to show signs of illness, collapsed during roll call. Her body trembled from fever, and her shallow breathing caused immediate concern among the other women. Greta rushed to her side, her heart pounding in her chest as she called for help. The camp doctor arrived quickly, his professional demeanor masking the concern in his eyes as he examined the young girl. He confirmed the diagnosis: influenza. Liesel's body had become too weak to fight off the illness, and she would need immediate care to survive. In that moment, something shifted within Greta. She had always been the one to keep the group together, to be the strong leader, but now, faced with the vulnerability of one of her own, she felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The illness had come at a time when they were all physically and emotionally drained, and the thought of losing one of their own was unbearable. For the first time since their arrival, the reality of their captivity hit Greta with full force. They were still at the mercy of forces beyond their control, and their survival depended not just on their resilience, but on the kindness of others. The camp doctor, after performing a quick examination, insisted that Liesel be moved to the infirmary for further treatment. He spoke in calm, measured tones, but it was clear that there was little time to waste. The flu, in such a vulnerable body, could spread quickly, and without the proper care, Liesel could fall into a more serious condition. Greta, though shaken, helped to carry the young woman to the infirmary, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. She had always been a pragmatist, but now, faced with the real possibility of death, she realized just how fragile life was in this place. Sam Washington, the camp cook, had heard the news about Liesel's illness, and, without hesitation, went to the infirmary to offer his help. He had always been a quiet presence in the camp, moving through his duties with calm efficiency, but now there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor. He didn't ask questions or hesitate. He simply went to work. It was then that Greta realized that Sam's care extended far beyond the kitchen. He was a man who knew what it meant to care for others, and his act of kindness was not just limited to feeding the women. It was an integral part of the humanity they were all clinging to. Sam had brought with him something unexpected, a bowl of cornbread soaked in warm milk with honey. The comfort food, something he had grown up with, was meant to help soothe Liesel's fever and bring her some much-needed strength. Greta watched in silence as Sam carefully fed Liesel a small spoonful of the mixture, his hands gentle as he held the spoon to her lips. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it was clear that this was more than just food. It was an act of compassion, a lifeline in the midst of their hardship. Liesel's eyes fluttered open as she tasted the cornbread, her face showing signs of recognition and relief. Greta could see the change in her skin no longer so pale, her breathing steadier. It was a small victory, but it was enough to restore a glimmer of hope in the room. Sam stayed for a while, quietly preparing more food for Liesel, but also offering support to the other women who had gathered around, watching with a mixture of gratitude and awe. The simple act of caring for each other, whether through food or kindness, had a profound impact on everyone in the room. It was as if the walls that had once separated them, captors and prisoners, were beginning to break down, one act of compassion at a time. Over the next few days, as Liesel recovered, the camp became a place of quiet solidarity. The women rallied around her, taking turns to keep her company, offering comfort, and even starting small tasks to help with the daily chores. The soldiers, too, offered what little they could: extra blankets, additional portions of food, and words of encouragement. The tension that had lingered since their arrival slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of shared responsibility for one another. Even the most reserved women, like Anna Marie, began to open up more, offering their own forms of support to their fellow prisoners and to the soldiers who had shown them unexpected kindness. Greta, who had always been the one to keep the group together, found herself reflecting on the changes that had taken place over the past few weeks. The camp had transformed from a place of fear and suspicion into a space where mutual respect and compassion could flourish. It was not perfect, but it was enough for now. The daily struggles of captivity were still there, but the women had learned to find strength in one another and in the small acts of care that defined their lives. Even in the darkest times, they had discovered that humanity could still shine through, one gesture at a time.
As Liesl regained her strength, Greta found herself standing in the mess hall one evening, looking around at the women who had become more than just fellow prisoners. They had become a family of sorts. They had fought against the odds, faced their fears, and survived the harshest conditions together. And now, as they sat around the table, sharing a meal and talking quietly among themselves, Greta realized that they had found something in this place that she had not expected: a sense of belonging. It was something they had lost when the war began, but something they had now regained, not just through their survival, but through their connection with each other.
The bond between the women had deepened, and with it, Greta began to see the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by war or captivity. It was a future of healing, of rebuilding, and of reclaiming what had been lost. The simple acts of kindness, like the cornbread that had nourished Liesl, had become symbols of something far more significant, a reminder that even in the worst of circumstances, people could still care for each other, still find ways to bring light into the darkness. As winter deepened and the cold became more unbearable, the camp seemed to fall into a quiet rhythm. The guards, once stiff and distant, now moved through the camp with an air of resignation, their eyes not quite as cold as before. The women, too, had settled into their daily routines, but there was an underlying tension that remained. The harsh realities of captivity could not be avoided, and no matter how many small comforts they had been given, the constant reminder of their situation lingered in every corner of the camp. Greta had been struggling with a growing sense of unease. The kindness that had once seemed like a beacon of hope now felt like a fragile thread, too delicate to hold everything together. She couldn't ignore the fact that they were still prisoners, that their fates were not entirely in their hands. Despite everything they had been given, they were still at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. The feeling of vulnerability began to creep back into her thoughts, especially as the days grew shorter and the cold grew more biting. One particularly hard evening, as Greta sat alone in the common room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Something fragile was beginning to crack. The camp had been relatively calm, but the winds of change were beginning to blow in a direction she didn't expect. There were whispers among the women, conversations that hinted at something more than the routines they had come to accept. Some spoke of the hope that perhaps they might one day be allowed to write letters home, or that their families were still alive and waiting for them. But Greta knew better than to get lost in the illusion of hope. She had seen too many people crushed by false promises. The news came on a cold December morning, shattering the fragile peace the camp had been clinging to. Margaret Sullivan, the camp administrator, entered the mess hall, her face pale, her expression tight with concern. She had a telegram in her hand, and the moment she stepped into the room, the women's conversations died down. The guards, too, stopped what they were doing, sensing that something important was happening. Margaret's voice was calm, but carried the weight of something far heavier. "I have just received word," she said, her words hanging in the air like a thunderstorm on the horizon, "that one of the soldiers has been listed as missing in action." Greta's heart skipped a beat. She knew that the missing soldier was none other than Sam Washington's son, Marcus. It hit her like a punch to the gut. Sam had been one of the few figures in the camp who had shown them the deepest kindness, and now his own son was in danger. Sam had always been a steady presence in the kitchen, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. But now, with the news of his son's disappearance, everything felt different. The warmth that had once defined his cooking, his approach to the women, now seemed distant, as though the spark that had kept him going had been extinguished.
Greta could see the pain in Sam's eyes when he learned the news. His usually composed demeanor faltered, and he sank into a chair, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the table. For a moment he seemed to disappear into himself, lost in thoughts of his son, and Greta felt an overwhelming wave of sympathy. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer some comfort, but words seemed useless in the face of such grief. Sam's world had just shattered, and there was nothing she could do to make it whole again.
The days following the news were filled with a quiet, heavy sadness. The soldiers, too, seemed affected by the news, their usual stoic expressions replaced by signs of strain. The women, while still prisoners, became more attuned to the grief that permeated the camp. It was as if the death of hope for one man had infected the entire camp, spreading silently but surely. Even the small acts of kindness, the moments of shared warmth, seemed to be less frequent, overshadowed by the weight of the unknown. What had once felt like a small, fragile hope began to seem like a mirage, fading away before their eyes. Greta found herself walking through the camp in a daze, her thoughts heavy with the knowledge of how fleeting life could be. She had spent so much time trying to hold on to the idea that survival meant holding on to hope, but now she wasn't so sure. The world they lived in was full of unpredictability and danger. The kindness they had been given had allowed them to survive, yes, but it had also shown them how delicate that survival was. It wasn't just the cold that could break them. It was the unpredictable forces of life, of war, of loss. As Greta stood near the mess hall, watching the women move through their routines, she realized that they had all changed in ways they hadn't fully understood. They had learned to rely on each other, to care for one another, and to accept the kindness that had been offered to them. But they had also learned something far deeper, the fragility of their own existence. The hope they had once held on to so tightly had been built on a foundation of kindness, but now they saw that kindness alone couldn't protect them from the cruel realities of the world. The loss of Sam's son reminded them all that hope could disappear in an instant, leaving only the harsh truth of their circumstances behind. That night, as the women gathered around the fire, Greta sat in silence, her mind racing. She watched as Liesl, who had once been so vulnerable, now offered words of encouragement to one of the older women who was struggling with the cold. There was strength in their unity, in their shared experiences, but it wasn't enough to erase the reality that they were still at war, still prisoners. As the fire crackled, Greta allowed herself a moment to reflect on everything that had led them here. They had come from a place of fear, of isolation, and had slowly learned to trust again. But now, with the loss of hope that Marcus's disappearance represented, they were forced to confront the reality that nothing could ever be certain again. Hope, as fragile as it was, had been their anchor. But with the storm clouds of uncertainty now gathering overhead, Greta knew that survival would require something far more than hope. It would require them to hold on to each other, to lean into the small acts of kindness and compassion that could still be found in the darkest of times. And perhaps, in doing so, they could find a way to continue surviving, even in a world that seemed intent on breaking them.